I'm back to talk more about metamorphic rocks. This time we're going to talk about metamorphic grade. So let me get my screen up again here. Okay, so I used the term metamorphic grade when we talked about different kinds of metamorphic rocks. And you might remember that metamorphic grade is something that refers to the amount of pressure and the level of temperature that a particular protolith was exposed to. And also it tells us a little bit about how much that rock will have changed as compared to the protolith kind of that it started out as. So the higher the grade, the higher the exposure to pressure and greater temperature. And that's going to translate into a rock that looks more changed. So when you're looking at a metamorphic rock, one of the ways that you can kind of work backwards to understand the grade of the rock is to imagine, how did this rock look originally and how different does it look now? And that is likely an indication of how much pressure and how high of temperature that particular rock was exposed to. So here's a little kind of chart that allows us to think about increases in temperature and increases in pressure. And remember, as we go down to greater depths within the earth, usually there's an increase in temperature and pressure together. But there may be some environments where there's increase in temperature that might be created by like exposure to a magma chamber or some movement of magma underneath the earth, or hotspot type of environment that doesn't necessarily correspond to a great increase in pressure. And there may be some kinds of shearing environments closer to the surface created by like transform boundaries or other kinds of earthquake movement that might create increases in pressure that don't necessarily correspond with really great increases in temperature. But in general, as we increase the pressure and the temperature that are usually corresponding to rocks being exposed to greater and greater depth within the earth, first we're going to start to have lower grade environments that might produce things like slate. Then we're going to have more intermediate environments that produce things like schists and phyllites. And then we're going to start to have higher grade environments that might produce things like gneiss, and things like quartz or marble may also be created from these more kind of intermediate to higher grade environments as well. And then we get into kind of partial melting, different kind of migmatite environments, and then we eventually get into true melting that leads to the refreezing eventually of rocks, in the case that leads to igneous rocks as opposed to metamorphic rocks. So this is one way to kind of visualize the change and then visualize the depth at which these kinds of things might be occurring. So in addition, we have this idea of metamorphic facies, which is a little different than the sedimentary facies that we talked about before. But in the case of metamorphic rocks, we refer to facies as these groups of rocks that form with similar minerals due to similar temperature and pressure history. So similar metamorphic grade environments where they formed result in similar rocks. So there are some facies that produce pretty similar rocks, and then some facies where there's more very different kinds of outcomes of rocks that might be created. But we talk about facies as opposed to just like one rock like slate forms in this environment, because there's different kinds of like protoliths that might be exposed to those different temperatures and pressures. Those different protoliths might be made up of different original ingredients like morphelsic minerals or mafic minerals. And so ultimately they're going to turn into different kinds of rocks, not only because of the temperature and pressure they're exposed to, but also because of the original ingredients that they formed. And so instead of saying we're always going to get this particular rock when we are exposed to temperature and pressure of this caliber, we're going to say we're going to get this facies, this group of rocks that might include a couple different types of rocks. And so this type of graph looks really similar to that metamorphic grade like table or graph that we looked at, image that we looked at on the last page, where we have increases in pressure and increases in temperature, that correspond with increases in depth. But here it's showing these different kinds of facies, these different groups of rocks that might form as a result of these different kinds of metamorphic environments. So we have kind of our hornfells, these groups that are created because of increases in temperature that don't unnecessarily cause increases in pressure around magma chambers. We can get like green schists and phibolites, blue schists, and so the different kinds of rocks will fall into these different facies. So anyway, just wanted to mention that concept, that idea. Another thing that you'll see in the environment are called metamorphic isogrades. So iso is like a line where we have the same thing, and then grade refers to these different kinds of zones of rocks that have been formed because of different kinds of metamorphic grade changes. And so what we often see on the landscape is that we have these different bands of different kinds of like facies or groups of rocks that exist on the landscape. And they correspond to the fact that these different types of rocks were formed in different environments, perhaps at like different depths along a subduction zone in the past. And in particular, we kind of draw the lines on the map where we first start to see particular index minerals that might be formed at particular temperature and pressure environments. And so let me take you to the next slide where I'm going to tell you about what an index mineral is. So index minerals are basically minerals that give us an index or help us understand the temperature and pressure environment or the metamorphic grade environment where a particular rock was forming. And we know already because of the Bowen reaction series that different minerals form and are stable over different ranges of temperature and pressure. And so, for example, chlorite, which is a mineral that we haven't talked a lot about so far, is kind of a green colored mineral. It tends to form in lower grade environments between like about 200 degrees Celsius and about 500 degrees Celsius. Muscovite mica, the like lighter kind of yellowish whitish colored mica, tends to form over a range of maybe like 250 degrees Celsius up to maybe more like 300 or 400 degrees, or sorry, more like 500 or 600 degrees Celsius. Biotite mica is going to be a little higher than that, then garnets, then things like starlight, which is shown here. It forms these little crosses, like forms little stars, and then sillimanite, which forms these bands as well, are different particular minerals that can help us index or can help us sort out the environment where the rock formed, because we know that they could only form and be stable over a particular range of conditions. And other minerals are not good index minerals because they are stable over a really wide range of temperatures and pressures. So things like quartz and feldspar are so common in the environment because once they form, they don't change very readily. They stay very stable over this wide range of temperatures and pressures. So seeing quartz or seeing feldspar minerals in a rock doesn't really tell us very much about the rock because that rock could have formed in a variety of locations. But index minerals can help us narrow down the conditions where a particular rock formed. And also, when we start to have sets of different index minerals together, they can help us further narrow down the environment. So for example, if we had a rock that had chlorite in it and also garnet in it, then there's only kind of a narrow range of temperatures here. You can see where this green band and then this orange band overlap. And so this rock that contains both those minerals at the same time must have formed in a metamorphic grade environment, in a temperature environment of around 500 degrees. If it was a lot hotter than that, then we wouldn't have chlorite still present. If it was a lot colder than that, then we wouldn't have had garnets forming. And so when we have sets of these index minerals, it really helps us narrow down and understand the environment where these different rocks were potentially forming. And then, of course, we know these different sets of index minerals exist within rocks of different grades. So like slates and phyllates being kind of lower grades, schists and gneisses being more higher grade types of environments. And then we can go back to what we looked at before and start to look at these bands of different kinds of rocks within the environment that can particularly be identified by these index minerals. And we can interpret then that these parts of the landscape were formed in particular environments where different areas were exposed to different temperatures and pressures, probably because they were buried in the past at different depths, potentially belong something like a subduction zone. So anyway, that is one way that we can use our understanding of metamorphic materials to understand the past. So the present is the key to the past, as we said when we first started thinking about metamorphic rocks. Okay, that's a good stopping point.